There is exactly one battle in all of American military history where United States soldiers and German Wehrmacht soldiers fought on the same side. One morning, one castle, one shared enemy. It happened on May 5th, 1945, 3 days before Germany surrendered. In a medieval fortress on a cliff in the Austrian Alps, American GIs and German regulars stood shoulder to shoulder and defended French prisoners against a Waffen-SS assault. Men who had been trying to kill each other for 3 years loaded their weapons and pointed them in the same direction. The history books barely mention it. Most Americans have never heard of it. It doesn't fit neatly into any narrative we tell about that war, about who we were, who they were, what it all meant. But here's what I keep thinking about. The standard version of this story focuses on the battle itself, the heroics, the rescue, the unlikely alliance. And yes, all of that is extraordinary. But the thing that stays with me, the thing that I think matters most, is what had to happen inside individual human beings before any of it was possible. Before American Captain John Lee could decide to trust a German officer he had never met. Before German Major Joseph Gangl could decide to commit treason against his own country in the last week of a war he had served for years. Before a Yugoslav handyman and an Austrian cook could walk through SS-controlled mountain roads alone because a group of exhausted prisoners in a medieval castle had run out of other options. This is not a story about a battle. It is a story about what people choose when the choice costs everything. Castle Itter sits on a cliff above the Inn River Valley in the Austrian Tyrol. Stone towers, medieval walls, a view that drops straight down to pine forests 300 feet below. In 1943, the Nazis turned it into a prison, but not for ordinary people. The inmates of Castle Itter were the most strategically valuable prisoners in all of German-occupied Europe. Hitler kept them alive the way a chess player keeps a queen off the board, not to use, but to deny the other side. Paul Reynaud, the French prime minister who had refused to surrender in 1940. The man who argued France should fight on when everyone around him was already writing the armistice. For that, the Germans despised him more than almost anyone. Édouard Daladier, another former prime minister. The man who signed the Munich Agreement and spent every year since living with that decision. Maxime Weygand, general, 78 years old, the man who had commanded all French forces during the collapse of 1940. Frail now, but carrying the weight of a nation's defeat in his posture. Marie-Agnès Callot, a woman whose presence in this castle told you everything about how ruthless the calculus of Nazi hostage-taking was. She was not a politician, she was not a general, she was a sister. Her brother's name was Charles de Gaulle, tennis champion Jean Borotra, former military commander Gustave Gamelin. Others. Hitler kept them breathing because dead men cannot be traded. As long as they were alive, there was theoretical leverage, negotiations that never materialized, exchanges that never happened, insurance policies written against a future that kept shrinking. By April 1945, the future had almost entirely run out. As Allied armies closed in from the west and the Soviet forces pressed from the east, a calculation in Berlin changed. Leverage only works if you survive to use it. If the Reich was collapsing, really collapsing, not retreating to regroup but genuinely ending, then these prisoners were no longer assets. They were liabilities, witnesses, living evidence of 4 years of crimes. Sometime in late April 1945, orders reached Castle Itter. If American forces approached the castle, the SS guards were to execute every prisoner before withdrawing. No survivors, no testimony. The prisoners did not know about these orders. They had a hidden radio. They listened to BBC broadcasts. They knew the Americans were in Bavaria, pushing east. They knew liberation was close, days away, maybe less. They could almost feel it through the stone walls. What they could not feel was the conversation happening in the castle's guardroom about what to do with them. On the morning of May 3rd, 1945, they woke up and the watchtowers were empty. The SS had left in the night, no announcement, no explanation. The gates were unlocked, the courtyard was silent. For one disorienting hour, it felt like freedom. Then, they looked at the roads below the cliff. Vehicles, troops moving in both directions, the chaos of a collapsing military that still had weapons and had received no orders to stop using them. The castle walls that had imprisoned them for years were now the only thing keeping them alive. They needed help. They needed it fast, and the roads between the castle and the Americans were full of exactly the kind of men who would shoot first. The prisoners gathered in the Great Hall. Former prime ministers, generals, a tennis champion, the sister of de Gaulle. They had survived 4 years in this castle. They might die in its last week. Someone needed to go for help. The obvious problem: every person in that room was recognizable. Renault's face had been on newspaper front pages across France. Wehrmacht had commanded armies. Any German soldier stopping them on the road would know exactly what he'd found. Then someone mentioned the Yugoslav. Zvonimir Chuchkovich was 22 years old. The Nazis had taken him from his village in Yugoslavia 2 years earlier and put him to work as a handyman at Castle Itter. He fixed things, cleaned things, fetched supplies from the village market. He had learned to be invisible in the specific way that forced laborers learn to be invisible, by being perfectly, completely ordinary. He was not on any propaganda poster. He was not recognizable to any German patrol. He was nobody. In that moment, being nobody was the most valuable thing a person could be. He also knew the terrain. 2 years of walking these mountain paths, he had memorized which roads had checkpoints, which forest trails bypassed them, which farmhouses were safe and which were not. He was carrying knowledge in his head that no map could give you. Renault asked if he was willing to try. Chuchkovich did not hesitate. They wrote a message on a scrap of paper, rough French, rough German. The words almost didn't matter. What mattered was getting it into American hands. He tucked it inside his shirt, walked to the castle gate, looked back once, and went down the mountain. What nobody noticed was Andreas Krobot slipping out through the kitchen door at almost the same moment. Krobot was the castle's cook. Austrian, born in these mountains, 50 years old, with the particular kind of local knowledge that comes from never leaving the place you grew up. Every farmhouse within 10 kilometers, every family, every rumor that passed between villages, including one rumor that none of the French prisoners had heard. There was a German officer in the valley, a Wehrmacht major named Josef Gangl. And according to what Krobot had pieced together from market conversations and whispered village gossip, this major had been doing something extraordinary, sheltering deserters from the SS, making contact with the Austrian resistance, quietly refusing to be part of the final fanatical stand that some German commanders were still calling for. Krobot didn't tell the prisoners about his plan. What would he say? I'm going to find a Wehrmacht officer and ask him to commit treason? I'm betting your lives on village gossip? He just went. He found Gangl in a farmhouse outside Vergel, sitting at a wooden table with 2 of his officers, studying maps with the focused expression of a man who has run out of good options and is trying to identify which bad option is least catastrophic. Krobot told him everything. Gangl asked 3 questions. How many prisoners? How many exits? How much time? Then he stood up, folded the map, and looked at his officers with an expression that suggested he had already made his decision before the cook finished speaking. Captain John Lee had been fighting Germans since France, 3 years of it. He had watched men die in Normandy, in the Ardennes, in Germany itself. Every piece of his training, every instinct built by 3 years of combat, said the man standing across from him in a German uniform was the enemy. Gangl spoke. Lee listened.
French VIPs, medieval castle on a cliff, SS execution orders, guards gone.
Unknown amount of time before someone with those orders and the willingness to carry them out showed up. Lee asked the obvious question.
Why should I trust you?
Gangl's answer was not an appeal to shared values. It was not a speech about humanity triumphing over ideology. It was something more honest than that. He had already crossed the line. He was already hiding Wehrmacht deserters from SS death squads. He was already in contact with the Austrian resistance. He was already, by the Third Reich's definition, a traitor. Trusting him was not the risk Lee thought it was, because Gangl had nothing left to lose by being honest, and everything to lose by being caught in a lie by the Americans who would control this region in 3 days. Lee thought about it. The smart move, the safe move, was to wait. Call up the regiment. Bring armor and infantry in force. Approach the castle with overwhelming numbers in daylight. The smart move took time that the people in that castle might not have. Lee extended his hand. The convoy that formed at dusk on May 4th was unlike anything that had ever moved through an active war zone. 1 American Sherman tank, 2 American jeeps, 14 GIs from the 12th Armored Division, 1 German Kubelwagen, a handful of Wehrmacht soldiers who had signed on to fight against their own side. Nobody talked. 3 years of being trained to kill the men sitting 5 feet away does not dissolve in an afternoon. The Americans watched the Germans. The Germans watched the Americans. Everyone watched the dark tree line on both sides of the mountain road. They stopped twice. First, a fallen tree across the road, 20 minutes to clear it while hands stayed near weapons and everyone listened for engines in the forest. Second, the sound of vehicles approaching. The convoy froze. An SS patrol maybe. The sound grew louder, then passed, then faded. They kept moving. Gangl rode in the Kubelwagen. He had removed his Nazi insignia, but he was still wearing Wehrmacht gray. If they hit a checkpoint, there was no version where that ended well, shot as a traitor by Germans or as a live enemy by Americans who didn't know about the handshake. By midnight, Castle Itter appeared on its cliff above them. Stone towers against the stars. No lights, no movement. Gangl went first, alone with 1 soldier. He walked the last kilometer in darkness and called out in German at the gate. Paul Renault stepped out to meet him. A French prime minister, prisoner for 4 years, face to face with a German officer in the last night of a war. Renault asked one question.
Are the Americans behind you?
Gangl said.
Right behind me.
May 5th, 6:30 in the morning. The sun comes over the Alps, and with it, the first bullet. It hits the stone wall above the main gate, then another, then 3 at once from different angles. The SS had found them. Lee shouts for positions. The defenders scatter to the walls. Americans take the north. Gangl's Germans take the east. And the French prisoners, politicians and generals in their 60s and 70s who have not fired a weapon in years, pick up rifles and take positions at the windows. General Weigand is 78 years old. He commanded entire armies when the men now shooting at him were children. He finds a second-floor window, settles the rifle against his shoulder, and opens fire. Renault will not hide. He moves between positions, completely exposed, encouraging men who were his jailers 3 days ago. The SS force in the tree line numbers somewhere between 100 and 200. Exact count impossible. The forest gives them cover, and they're probing the defenses, testing angles, looking for the weakness they will eventually find. Lee's Sherman fires its main gun. The blast shakes every stone in the castle. A section of tree line erupts. The SS fire slows for a moment, then comes back heavier. Sometime in mid-morning, Joseph Gangl sees it. Renault has moved to an exposed window. He is watching the tree line, probably trying to understand the tactical situation, old habits of a man who once commanded nations. He is completely visible. Any sniper below with a clear line of sight can see him. In the tree line, a rifle swings toward that window. Gangl runs. The shot cracks across the courtyard. Joseph Gangl falls, the German major who committed treason against the Third Reich to save French prisoners. The Wehrmacht officer who shook hands with the Texas captain on a forest road. The man who made a choice about what kind of soldier he was going to be in the last week of a war that was already lost. He is dead before he hits the ground. The bullet meant for Paul Renault found Joseph Gangl instead. For a moment, everything in that courtyard stops. Americans and Germans and French prisoners all looking at the same body. A man in Wehrmacht gray who died for a French politician he met 12 hours ago. Something that has no category in any language any of them were trained to use. Then the SS fire intensifies, and there is no more time for anything except survival. The Sherman takes a hit, not destroyed, but the turret jams. The gun still fires but cannot traverse properly. Ammunition across the whole defense is running critically low. Lee sends a runner, a young American private named Shimchik. Find the 12th Armored. Find the 142nd Infantry. Tell them what is happening. Bring reinforcements. Shimchik slips out through a side gate and runs down the mountain with SS fire snapping through the trees around him. The forest is not safe. Every step could be his last. He runs anyway. Inside the castle, the defenders hold. Gangel's German soldiers, now without their commander, fight with the particular fury of men who have something to prove, not to the Americans and not to the French, but to themselves, to the memory of the officer who showed them what a choice looked like. By midday, ammunition is nearly gone. Then, someone on the wall shouts, vehicles on the road below, coming fast. Lee raises his binoculars. His hands are not steady. American tanks, American infantry. The 12th Armored charging up the mountain road. Shimchik made it. The SS see the armor at the same moment. Caught between the castle and fresh American forces, the assault collapses. Some flee into the forest. Some surrender. The rest are cut down. By early afternoon, it is over. The history books that mention Castle Itter at all usually focus on the battle, the tactics, the improbable alliance, the rescue. And it is all worth telling, every detail of it. But the thing I keep returning to is what had to be true about Joseph Gangel before any of it was possible. He was not some doubter who secretly opposed the war from the beginning. He was a career soldier. He had served the Wehrmacht for years. He had an Iron Cross on his chest, which means he had done things the Third Reich considered worth rewarding. At some point, not in a dramatic moment, not when the cameras were rolling, but quietly, in the privacy of his own thinking, he had crossed a line. He had decided that following these particular orders in service of this particular outcome was something he would not do. And then he had started acting on that decision, one small step at a time, hiding deserters, meeting with resistance contacts, and finally, on the last weekend of the war, committing open treason to protect people he did not know. We don't know exactly when that decision happened inside him. We don't know what it cost him in sleepless nights before anyone else knew. We only know what it produced in the end. He gave his life for it on May 5th, 1945. Most tellings of the Castle Itter story spend their time on the generals and the politicians and the tank commander, understandably. But I want to spend a moment on Zvonimir Chuchkovich, a 22-year-old forced laborer from Yugoslavia who walked through SS-controlled mountain territory alone with a note in his shirt to find soldiers he had never met and tell them something they had no particular reason to believe. He had no rank, he had no weapons, he had no authority and no protection. If an SS patrol had stopped him, he had no cover story that would hold up for long. He was nobody. And he went anyway. Not because he was ordered to, the prisoners asked him, not commanded him. Not because he was brave in some abstract heroic sense, but because someone had to go and he was the right person to go and he understood that. His name doesn't appear in most accounts of this battle. He has no memorial I can find. He became invisible again, the way he had learned to be invisible, perfectly, completely, without complaint. He was 22 years old, and he saved the lives of some of the most historically significant people in Europe by taking a walk through a dangerous forest. 3 days after the battle, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Paul Renault returned to French politics. He would serve in several more governments and write extensively about the war. General Weygand lived to be 98 years old. He never fully escaped the shadow of 1940. Marie-Agnès Caillot went home to France. Her brother Charles de Gaulle became one of the defining figures of the 20th century. Joseph Gangel was posthumously declared a hero of the Austrian resistance. There is a street named after him in Wörgl, a memorial plaque, the recognition that came too late to matter to him, but perhaps matters to someone. Captain John Lee survived the war and went home to Texas. He did not speak extensively about May 5, 1945, perhaps because there was no easy language for it. Zvonimir Chuchkovich went home to Yugoslavia. There is very little record of what happened to him after the war. He disappears from the historical record the way he learned to disappear in the castle's corridors, quietly, completely, without announcement. What do we do with a story like this? The comfortable version is to say it proves something uplifting about human nature, that even in the worst circumstances, people can transcend the categories they have been assigned: enemy, friend, prisoner, guard, German, American. But I think the harder truth is more interesting. Joseph Gangel did not transcend his category in some mystical sense. He made a series of decisions over time, in private, at personal cost, that accumulated into a character capable of what he did on May 5th. It was not a miracle, it was a choice. And then another choice. and then another. Most of those choices happened when nobody was watching, when there was no battle to fight and no castle to defend, when it was just a man deciding, quietly, what kind of person he was going to be. That is the part of the story that gets left out, and it might be the most important part of all.